Good afternoon. Welcome to the discussion on diversifying the Quad, opportunities in geoeconomics, technology, climate change, and health. The Quad leaders are set to meet in person for the first time on September 24th, 2021. This is clearly a seminal moment in international relations. In the previous Quad summit, held in March 2021, the participating nations chose to expand the Quad's agenda from a strategic partnership to include three other specific areas in which they want to collaborate: the Quad Vaccine Partnership, Quad Climate Working Group, the Quad Critical and Emerging Technologies Working Group. Therefore, as the leaders meet, it is the right time for us to examine how the evolution of Quad has taken place, the purpose and the relevance of these specific initiatives, and what the Quad is likely to do or what it should do, specifically in geoeconomics, which has one of the areas which has featured less than some of the others so far. To help us examine these recent developments with the Quad, we have a rich panel. We welcome Ambassador Kurt Tong, partner with the Asia Group, but also a former diplomat, a career diplomat for the United States, having represented the United States for APEC and TPP. We also have Dr. Masahiro Kawai, served as the Deputy Vice Minister for Finance and International Affairs, also led the Asian Development Bank Institute and the Policy Research Institute of Japan, two leading research institutions. Jennifer Jackett, she's a scholar, but actually on leave from the Australian government, but a scholar at the National Security College with Australian National University, and she focuses on critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, international defense, and defense capability. She's here in her personal capacity today. And finally, Ambassador Lata Reddy, whom we know very well here in India, but she's obviously very well known in our policy circuit around the world. She's a former diplomat for India, has served as India's ambassador to Portugal and Thailand, and of course has also been India's Deputy National Security Advisor with a special focus on cybersecurity and cyber affairs. So I welcome you all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We will first take opening remarks, about 5 minutes each from all the panelists on the topic at hand today, and then we will get into a set of moderated questions which I have for the panelists today. So with that, let me first invite Ambassador Kurt Tong to give his opening remarks. Over to you, Ambassador.
Great, thank you, and good morning, everyone, from here in Washington. I'm not sure what time you'll all be listening to this around the world. It's a real pleasure to be joining this excellent panel for a very important topic. And I think it's also particularly suitable that the conversation is being hosted by ORF based in India. Because from the US perspective, thinking about the Quad, India is really the crucial participant. And the value of the grouping and the organization that comes out of it really is based upon the desires and hopes for creating incentives and opportunities for India in areas like economic development, further strengthening of commitment to democracy, strengthening India's look eastward policy in general, and its participation on key transnational issues as a way of reinforcing positive trends towards India's long-term contribution to the global commons. Often people talk about the Quad, and certainly it took a long time to get the Quad up and running at senior levels because of this conversation about, is this grouping intended to contain China or somehow combat the rise of China? I'd have a different view of this group. It's more about working together to achieve positive outcomes for the region and for the planet in ways that are cognizant of the essentially disappointment that these countries feel based upon the pattern that China has taken as it has become such an important global player. China is the world's largest country, both in terms of population and now in terms of economy. India will soon be the world's largest nation in terms of population, and eventually in terms of economic throw weight as well. And so shaping relationships and creating incentives and cooperation patterns that have a positive influence on the region, I think that's my understanding of the objectives of the Quad formulation, and this year is a good year for that. The first leaders meeting happened virtually. This week we'll have the first in-person leaders meeting in Washington. And if you look at the agenda, and it's our topic for the day in economics, technology, climate, health, it's clearly focused on exactly that, on creating patterns of cooperation and positive outcomes, and creating muscle memory for these four important nations to work together based upon common values on important global and regional challenges. So I'm quite optimistic about how this will go going forward. There's lots of details, lots of challenges, bumps in the road as the cooperation proceeds, but I think it's a great idea. It's off to a good start, and hopefully we'll see some interesting outcomes this week.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tong. May I now invite Jennifer to give her opening remarks?
Yes, thank you so much, Akshay, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm based in Canberra and it's the evening time here. I'm going to pick up on one of the points that Ambassador Tong mentioned around technology cooperation. So as the listeners will know, in March this year, Quad leaders identified critical and emerging technologies as a shared priority and established a working group to develop cooperation in this area. Since then, technological disruption in the Indo-Pacific has only continued apace, and the implications of new technologies are becoming ever clearer. The economic prosperity of nations is increasingly tied to their ability to harness the speed and efficiency of 5G telecommunications, artificial intelligence for automation, biotechnology to cure diseases, and clean energy technologies to mitigate climate risks. But from a national security perspective, the connectedness of devices through the Internet of Things creates additional vectors for malicious cyber activity, and advances in areas like quantum and space are being leveraged for military advantage. Whichever country or countries maintains a lead in the development, use, and governance of critical and emerging technologies will amplify their national power and be better placed to secure their interests and in line with their values. In other words, technological advances will redistribute economic and military weight. So this is the strategic and urgent reality that's driving closer Quad cooperation on technology. Quad members already have the necessary foundations for deeper technology cooperation. In global value chains, Quad members play complementary roles. Each partner brings something to the table, whether it's innovative potential, talent, materials, capital, manufacturing heft, regulatory frameworks, or capacity building know-how. Quad members also have converging interests in a reliable, secure, and diverse supply of critical technologies. They want their researchers and companies to compete fairly and benefit from their innovation and investment. Quad members also share an ambition to maintain their technological edge so that they can continue to develop cutting-edge capabilities, compete commercially, and shape global technology governance. So building on these shared capabilities, shared interests, and ambitions, the focus for the first in-person Leaders Summit will be to consolidate the growing momentum through a more practical technology agenda and to help build the bureaucratic engagement needed to deepen habits of cooperation longer term. One area of focus is likely to be on closer coordination among Quad members on governance and policy approaches to technology. For example, finalising principles for how technology is designed, developed, governed, and used, including that technology should be shaped by democratic values and respect for human rights, and also cooperation on approaches to countering unwanted knowledge transfer in sensitive research areas. Another focus is likely to be more technical or technology specific, like coordination in international technology standard setting bodies, the development and rollout of secure and open 5G telecommunications networks, and also starting to map supply chains in priority areas like semiconductors or chips to understand potential vulnerabilities. Longer term, there remain many opportunities for the Quad to build on this agenda and pursue new areas of cooperation, especially in particular areas like battery supply chains or biotechnology. Despite the strong foundations for cooperation, though, and the ambitious agenda, it would be remiss of me not to mention, too, that there are naturally areas of commercial competition and difference. Moreover, the Quad is not the only voice that exists or that is needed on critical technologies issues. Many important players in the region, not least ASEAN, but also South Korea and the UK, Canada, and the EU, all have roles to play. The Quad is just one thread in the region's diplomatic fabric promoting dialogue and cooperation. And at a time of great geopolitical uncertainty, this summit presents a key moment to build a positive and practical technology agenda that can create both security and economic benefits, not only for the Quad, but for the wider region. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. May I now request Dr. Kawai to come in and give his opening remarks?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here to talk about Quad agendas. In the first Quad summit in March this year, the spirit of Quad was adopted, which called for a free, open, inclusive, and healthy Indo-Pacific, which is anchored by democratic values and unconstrained by coercion. I think these are the principles that guide the Quad countries. Needless to say, Quad is the core of the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific region. We have to include inclusive, adjective, free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. So Quad as a core grouping is expected to guide the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, Quad alone cannot do it. Quad needs to attract interests of many countries in the Indo-Pacific region and also outside of the region. We know that Quad and more largely the Indo-Pacific concept is supported by the United Kingdom, the European Union, and Canada is beginning to join. And we need to attract the interests of South Korea and ASEAN, which has issued the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and other Indo-Pacific developing economies. So I think the core of the Indo-Pacific Quad as a core has a very large role to play. So in order to do so, naturally Quad has been expanding its interest, just not only the security issues, but also non-security issues like economic, technology, climate and health issues, and perhaps other issues may be explored in the future. So the first summit created 3 working groups, and I think it's a good opportunity for the Quad leaders to take stock of what these working groups have achieved. And naturally, economic issues are very important. Giving economic substance to the Quad activity is very, very important because without that, it's going to be very difficult to attract interests of many other countries, particularly countries like ASEAN countries and other developing countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So I very much look forward to discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kwai. And with that, may I come to you, Ambassador, ready for your opening remarks?
Thank you, Akshay. I'm delighted to be here on this occasion, and I particularly am happy to be speaking on the very important and very topical subject of the Quad formation or reformation. I would rather not speak on what happened in 2007 and 2008 when the Quad was first formed, because I think we all know that that did not end well. I would rather talk on what was the process that happened in the decade between 2008 and 2017, which led to the reformation of the Quad in a certain sense. During this time, there were trilateral meetings between Japan, India, Australia, between US, India, and Japan, and between US, Japan, and Australia. These trilaterals, the various bilateral agreements and meetings that were concluded, the 2+2, the heads of the defense and foreign policy establishments meeting between India and Japan, India and the US, India and Australia. And I think an important development was also the India-Japan Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. All of these, I think, built mutual trust in trying again to resurrect the Quad. They also ensured a certain interoperability and a sounder foundation for good political ties between the 4 nations. In 2017, as we know, the US and Japan proposed the formal setting up of what I call the Quad 2.0 at Manila, and also emphasize the centrality of ASEAN, which was one of China's arguments against the Quad. I think the in-person summit, which is going to take place, well, now day after tomorrow, is very important. And the working groups that was referred to earlier are also important, because one was, of course, on the vaccine partnership. There was one on climate, and there was one on critical and emerging technologies. Now, the question is on the health. As we all know, the crises of our times, what has been preoccupying all of us has been the COVID pandemic. And I think many things have come about as a result of this preoccupation. We have understood that we require a more global, a more equitable system for vaccine distribution. We realize that we need a thorough reform of public health systems in many countries. And I think that this is perhaps one of the most important issues of our time. And I'm assuming that even during the in-person summit, this is going to be a very important focus. Secondly, the climate working group is continuing with its work. And I think it was a clever move to have the climate working group, because in a sense, since China is also very much a part of the climate ecosystem and is prepared to cooperate on many aspects of climate, in a sense, you have introduced a subject where everyone can agree, and it doesn't become a binary or a Quad versus China issue. And finally, on critical and emerging technologies, I'd agree with Jennifer that this is very, very important. And I think the working group was given a very clear sense of set of issues to work on. One was a statement of principles on technology. The other was development of standards. The third was telecom deployment and cooperation with industry. And that's where the 5G question comes in, which I think is, again, a very pressing issue of our time. And the trends and oppositions relating to all these technologies, the critical and emerging technologies, including biotechnology, and the dialogue on critical technology supply chains, very important, because that ties into the geoeconomics part, where you're going to talk about how you're going to replace these supply chains, and trade and investment. Where are the new manufacturing units going to be set up if you have lost confidence in the old manufacturing units? Now, I just want to end with remarking on one thing which we haven't talked about and which I think is important. This is the question of the new agreement on AUKUS, which is, of course, the acronym for Australia, I think the US agreement and the UK agreement on the nuclear-powered submarines. This has been very much in the press. And it's interesting because India has come out today with a very clear statement, the Foreign Secretary, that there is no link between AUKUS and the Quad. India is not a party to AUKUS, and therefore it's not relevant to the Quad discussions, nor will it impact on the Quad functioning. Now, this, I think, is an important statement which all of us have to take note of in view of the forthcoming summit. And India and the US in their bilateral, they've also indicated, will discuss trade and investment ties, which again ties into the geoeconomics question. Defense and security collaborations, that was bound to be, and green energy partnership, which again ties into climate change. How do we operationalize the 4 foundational defense agreements between the US and India? And the final statement by the Foreign Secretary, which was very interesting, was that AUKUS is a security alliance. And, you know, whereas our work on in the Quad, in the Indo-Pacific region, is to keep it free, open, transparent, and inclusive. So there's a very clear distinction being drawn between AUKUS and the Quad. And I think that would certainly be one of the topics which will be very interesting to focus on in the forthcoming summit. The other interesting thing the Foreign Secretary said was that the Malabar exercise is not connected to the Quad, which I think, again, we have to take note of, because if China sees this as a military exercise against China, you know, what we are doing in a certain sense is distancing the Malabar exercise, which involves all the 4 Quad nations presently, from the functioning of the Quad itself. And I think really I would end there, because I know there's a 5-minute limit and I probably exceeded it. And I look forward to having more intense discussions in the little time we have left. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi. Let me allow me to dig a little deeper now on some of the issues that you've mentioned, as well as what are under consideration today for Quad. I want to start particularly with Ambassador Tong and Dr. Kwai. And the first question I'm going to pose to you is actually on geoeconomics. You've both worked on designing framework for economic cooperations, particularly in the Asia Pacific, from the perspective of the United States, and your contribution, Ambassador Tong, for APEC, and as well as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I understand. Also, Dr. Kwai, you worked a lot on economic integration in Asia. The question I have for both of you is this. It's a long shot for us, it seems, to even think of an economic imperative or framework that can go potentially with the Quad. I mean, there is the Indo-Pacific construct within which there is within which we have the construct of the Quad. It seems really hard to put an economic framework to the Quad. But if we were to give some suggestions on what that geoeconomic framework would look like, what would be the contours? What would we put on the agenda to provide a basis, an economic basis for the cooperation that Quad has today on strategic issues? So let me start with you, Master Tong, first, and then I'll come to you, Dr. Kwai.
Sure, it's an excellent question, and you're right that the Quad is not a natural formulation for a tight economic consortium, if you will, at the macroeconomic level or on trade relations. And certainly it's quite obvious that there is no discussion of a Quad free trade agreement or trade panels, discussion about at the border or behind the border barriers to economic activity in the Quad formulation. It's not a natural grouping for that discussion. We have three high-income nations, a developing nation, one very large, some small, exporters, importers. It's a rather diverse group for that conversation. And frankly, India has economic policies which would make it difficult to create a reciprocal framework among those four countries, given the level of protectionism both at the border and behind the border in the Indian economy. So that doesn't mean you can't talk about economics. I'm always confused by this term geoeconomics. Like, what's the difference between geoeconomics and regular economics? But what I see the Quad group doing, which is smart, is to take specific pieces of economic activity that are hot topics, high on the agenda, and explore them as cooperative issues based upon, again, the idea that we have the four nations have some shared values and capabilities and a shared interest in pushing global policy in a useful direction. And so that's I think the underpinning behind the conversation that Jennifer was starting to get into about technological cooperation, discussion of supply chain resilience and security, etc. And we have these other topics of climate and health. They are also essentially economic topics. They're also transnational challenges that need to be addressed using economic policy means, along with technology and scientific means. And so there's ample opportunity for focused, specific interventions by these four nations to really push things along in a positive direction on specific issues. So that's what I expect to see in the sort of economics basket for the Quad is rather focused, specific activity, not a general set of principles or aspirations around economic amalgamation among the four.
Ambassador Tong, what did you make of the supply chain resilience initiative that was announced?
Well, I think that's an example. So clearly, this with COVID having happened and disruptions due to the trade conflict between the United States and China, there have been a number of supply chains that have been disrupted of late, which is having a serious and negative impact on many economies. So the idea of the Quad countries, I think it's a little bit ambitious and it might be difficult, but the idea of mapping supply chains and figuring out what some of the bottlenecks are, and then discuss whether there are targeted investments that could be made to try and relieve those bottlenecks, whether it's on, frankly, vaccine development or green technologies, addressing those global issues, but also on semiconductors, on batteries, on other key technologies for positive future economic development. I think it's a very useful conversation. I think it's difficult because a lot of the means to addressing these problems exist in the private sector rather than in the public sector. But it's a useful and conversation to have, and could have some real positive benefits.
Thank you. Dr. Kawai, do you think there is an economic imperative here for the Quad that's worth examining?
Yeah, okay, thank you. As Ambassador says, this Quad grouping may not be a natural grouping, which is driven by proximity or natural economic and human links. But out of the four countries, Australia, Japan, and the United States did agree on TPP, and so the issue is whether India is willing to come to that level in terms of economic liberalization and domestic reform. I think that's really the issue. Naturally, given the large population of India, India has huge economic potential. If per capita income of India becomes high, like 10,000 US dollars, then its economy becomes about the same as China's. That's huge potential. How fast can India grow? That's a very important issue, and how the other Quad members can help India in growing. So once India achieves rapid economic growth, India would have a huge potential to further open up its economy. So potential for economic integration among the Quad member countries and the major Indo-Pacific countries would be huge. I was looking at some trade statistics. The Quad member countries, well, at least two members, Australia and Japan, are very dependent on China on the export side and import side. Australia's export dependence on China is amazing. If China includes Hong Kong, it's about 40% on the export side. On the import side, it's 30%. Japan, more than 25% on both export and import side. In contrast, India and US do not depend so much on China as a share of trade, although India's import dependence on China is growing. It's now about 20%. But the Quad member countries' trade dependence on other Quad members is relatively limited. In the case of Australia, it's about 20% export-import side, so much less than China. India's export dependence on Quad is 20%, relatively high, but not on the import side, only 12%. Japan around 20%. So Japan's trade dependence on China is higher than its trade dependence on other Quad members. The U.S. Of course trades a lot with Canada, and Quad members trade share for China, for the United States, is limited, less than 10%. But the United States trades with Quad friends of Quad, so to speak. Canada, the EU, UK. So the point I'm making is that unless we increase our mutual trade dependence, the closeness of the Quad member countries may be fragile. So it's quite important to push for greater trade among and investment among Quad members. So from that perspective, if you create a FTA matrix for Quad member countries and friends of Quad and also China, among the Quad member countries, the United States and India do not have an FTA. We have trade agreements among the Quad member countries, although the Japan-US trade agreement is a limited trade agreement, which was forged under the Trump administration. There's further potential for Japan and the United States to work on full-fledged FTA if the United States is ready. On the India-US FTA, India may not be ready, the US may not be ready, but more kind of cooperative approach is welcome thing to see. Why don't I stop at this point?
So a quick follow-up for you, Dr. Kawai, as well as for Ambassador Tong on this subject before we move away from this subject. Maybe FTA is too ambitious, and you have both made the point very clearly on the economic disparity and just the integration in global trading system, the disparity in the global trading system, specifically with respect to India. But perhaps there are some incentives that can be given. We remember the initial incentive that was given by Japan to incentivize its industries from diversifying away from China. Are there other such ideas, anything specific that can be done to encourage, incentivize these supply chains to diversify or towards each other? First to Dr. Kawai and then to Ambassador Tong.
Certainly, industrial cooperation among Quad countries, including India, would be an important way to go, and also digital trade agreements. I'm not sure, how deeply India can go, but digital trade agreement may be something that the Biden administration can work on, which is now under negotiation, I believe, between Australia and the United States. India can come in among the Quad member countries. So there are several things that can be done sectoral approach.
Ambassador Tong?
Yeah, I agree with that. Again, I don't see the Quad becoming a negotiating framework for economic issues. It can be a cooperation framework for specific economic questions like the supply chain matter that we discussed already. I could see three areas for discussion, not negotiation, in the Quad. One would be the question of digital trade that Dr. Kohai pointed out. There is a conversation in the United States about whether to join the DEPA, which is this digital economy agreement sponsored by Australia, Singapore, and Chile, and expand the membership based upon that structure, or try to do something different that is a little bit more ambitious. I personally hope that the US goes for the DEPA approach, but having that conversation with India as well. What does India want to do? How does it want to solidify its point of view and position on a lot of these important data-related issues, digital-related issues like data privacy, cross-border data flows, the appropriate and inappropriate use of data and artificial intelligence, etc. That's an important topic. I think it could be explored in the Quad and then translated into independent action by the four, including in other multilateral fora like the DEPA. Another one would be the whole question about India's membership in APEC. I think it's become clear that India would be a good partner in APEC, but it hasn't really bought off on the idea that it needs to take some specific actions to show that it's committed to the idea of economic integration that is incorporated in APEC. And of course, everyone in APEC, their performance on market opening and economic integration is inconsistent, to say the least, but there needs to be a commitment to the ideas, and some discussion of that could be an interesting Quad topic. There could also be exploration of specific sectors where India could be seen as the future sort of global manufacturing center, and a conversation about what would be the necessary policy mix that the US, Australia, and Japan could perhaps have conversations with India about that would lead those three countries to make India into the essentially substitute global manufacturing center for the China-centric model in many sectors currently. Not to make China poor, but to create more global competition and help everybody out. That would be a good conversation. I think all three of those topics are very complicated, and I would not expect to see anything this year or maybe even next year on these questions. But I think it's worth pursuing as long as people understand that we're not trying to, or I don't think we should try to use this Quad and make it into a binding sort of negotiation type framework.
Fair enough. Fair enough. The message is clear. It's too early to talk about the economic imperative, perhaps definitely unnatural at this point. Perhaps some sectoral issues can be discussed for now. But even if that was the case, it would not culminate or crystallize into anything anytime soon. So we leave it there and move towards something which seems a little bit less upstream, perhaps downstream, because there's already work on this subject, which is technology and critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. So why don't I ask Jennifer and Ambassador Radhareddy to come in here? What are the contours of a technology cooperation framework that we are now seeing emerging? You've mentioned standards. Both of you mentioned the role of standards. Both of you mentioned the ability to connect, to make the Quad countries and the industries commercially competitive. Both of you mentioned the links technology has with the defense sector. Can you expound on that a little bit more? I'll start with you, Jennifer. Where of all these things, first of all, what does the contours look like? What is the framework today? And where are you seeing the most progress? Or what are the most important issues even amongst these 5 things that we've discussed?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and obviously something that Quad leaders are currently grappling with. I think the starting point for such a framework is where the Quad working group is currently focused, and that's on the principles for the development and use of technology. It's from there that many of the other activities can be built. So I think, first of all, agreeing or at least discussing among Quad countries, what are those values and principles that we would expect to see in technology and to guide how technology is used. And that might be things like human rights, right to privacy, free speech, talking about ethical issues. I think that's a very big and difficult conversation, and it becomes more complex when you start to apply those principles to actually to different types of technologies. So if you think about the use of artificial intelligence, whether it's sort of in a recruitment context or in the context of military capabilities, they're very challenging conversations to have around where we actually draw the boundaries for the types of decisions that certain technologies might be programmed to make. Or if you take the example of biotechnology and think about genome editing or DNA editing, you know, the kind of ethical frameworks that we need to guide how that works. So I think there's a lot of foundational work to do still around what those common principles are between Quad countries. And then that allows you to actually expand to other areas of cooperation. So building on those common principles, another critical focus area is actually on the broader governance frameworks for key technologies. So critical infrastructure and 5G telecommunication security being a priority there. That will be a backbone technology for the digital economy in all of the Quad countries, but also for other countries across the Indo-Pacific. So building consensus around the security principles that we would expect for that type of technology, supporting third countries on things like technical assessments, you know, building a bit of a governance framework, not only that Quad countries can utilize, but actually use across the Indo-Pacific to partner with countries elsewhere. I think another big issue for the Quad to grapple with which Ambassador Tong touched on, is data, and having a conversation around expectations for how data is stored and used. Data is obviously critical to all aspects of the digital economy, but it's an issue on which countries have different standards potentially and different regulatory frameworks. So trying to progress that conversation, that will also help with some of those other cross-border flow issues that can help with digital trade. But I think beyond that, partnering beyond the Quad in some of these international groupings in the UN or in standard setting organizations, you know, that's where a lot of the global governance takes place for these technologies. And I think the Quad can play a role coordinating together in some of those bodies. We've already touched on other areas of potential cooperation too around supply chains, particularly in semiconductors, but also on issues like batteries. But I think that more specific and practical cooperation will come as a result of getting some of those principles and governance foundations set early on.
Jennifer, if I may be allowed to ask a follow-up question that I think is critical on the issue of lithium-ion or storage technologies. The concentration and the supply chains are so integrated between, particularly in East Asia, between Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, United States, but also China. What is your perspective? I mean, how should we guide our approach towards supply chains, particularly of these critical technologies?
Yeah, I think the first step which the Quad may focus on is mapping those supply chains to actually understand what the landscape looks like. But the reality is that these supply chains, you know, especially for something like semiconductors or critical minerals or batteries, there are particular nodes where production and supply is highly concentrated, and that's just the reality of some of these very complex supply chains where many countries have a role to play. So I think the first thing is actually understanding where some of those vulnerabilities or choke points might be. And also, I guess, discouraging countries to use those concentrations or choke points as leverage or as an advantage in an economic context. And part of that's just around upholding global norms and rules around trade. But I think the first thing is to kind of understand where those choke points are, and then over the long run, if there is a need to diversify, or if there is a need in some instances to maybe build greater sovereign capability or onshore, despite the fact that that's very expensive and may not actually be in many countries' interests. Potentially there are specific areas where the US and others may wish to do that. But overall, I think it's about understanding those vulnerabilities and then ensuring that we uphold global trade rules so that those interdependencies and those choke points aren't actually used as an advantage in a geoeconomic context.
Ambassador Reddy, how do you view the progress we have made on technology cooperation or cybersecurity cooperation?
Well, I would say, Akshay, that technology cooperation is a very wide subject. So it would be very difficult to answer that in one all-encompassing sweep, because if you think about it, nuclear technology is technology, defense technology is technology, counterterrorism or the use of technology by counterterrorism and for terrorism is also a tool of, technology is used as a tool. Green energy, we've talked about space, and the specific science and technology collaboration agreements we have with certain countries, including Australia and the US, I know for sure. The health sector has become a huge area for technology because of the use of digital records, because of the use of digital means in technology, and very important life and death issues, as we've discussed in the past. And epidemic intelligence, which has again come into focus now because of the COVID pandemic. So technology has permeated practically every area of life. I think the challenge before the working group, and I'm presuming a working group or a similar mechanism will continue as a result of the actual summit taking place on Friday, it will actually delineate some specific areas where we can cooperate. And I'm hoping that this will lead to some concrete outcomes for the Quad. And I would specifically talk about the areas of data governance, data flows, privacy, who owns the data, because these are very important issues at the moment. Can the Quad come up with a common position on this? Because obviously there are widely differing ideas about this. And I think the question of privacy and, definitely, as Jennifer has already said, the question of norms and internet governance and technology governance, really, who's going to set these standards, who's going to work on these, and can the Quad come out with some meaningful statements on where we see this debate going? So I think the canvas is vast. I see a lot of scope currently in cooperating on telecom issues and on cybersecurity issues, because I think these two are really paramount in everybody's mind at the moment. And to add to that, I would say the health sector, the use of digital intelligence in the health sector.
Okay. Ma'am, I see that, I take your point is very well taken, that the technology canvas is very wide. It seems like we are making progress on many issues, but specifically we've set up a working group now for emerging technologies, which at least should provide at least some foundational guiding principles, Jennifer, if I can take your words, and which may then allow us to then create more specific action plans on where we can go. So I think the points on technology are very well taken. I think you also mentioned, Master Reddy, how health has come into this. You mentioned the point of health technology, and I think Ambassador Tong brought in the point about the specific task force we have now on vaccine, but even without the task force initially, there was a lot of work on how the vaccine supply chains can be supported. So I think both on health we have covered. We have left one area out, which is climate. And I was wondering if, I understand one of you mentioned that climate, I think Ambassador Reddy, it was you, that it is certainly one area in which we can all agree on. And we also have a working group now. Ambassador Reddy, so I'll just ask you for this opinion. Are you sanguine about the climate working group and what the Quad can do about climate?
I think definitely on clean energy, green energy, we can do a lot. The Solar Alliance has shown that, and it's not just Quad members, but many countries all over the world have signed on to the Solar Alliance. So I think that would definitely be an area. I think the question of emissions, the question of reaching goals is a harder one, because there is a real debate between the countries that have already achieved a high level of industrialization, whether they should pay the costs, or whether countries who are still struggling with developmental issues should be penalized, and those who have already used it should get away scot-free. So it's a very emotional issue, for many countries, because the feeling is polluters are polluted but don't want to pay, and we are being prevented from developing. This is the point of view from the developing countries. So I would say on climate change, it'll be harder to achieve total consensus on the way forward, but it's certainly something that's occupying the whole world. The freak weather we've been having, the flooding, the unseasonal weathers, I think have frightened everybody. The rising temperatures in some places, and the floods and so on. So I think there's certainly an incentive to cooperate, but whether or not that'll trump the economic considerations is something which remains to be seen. But it's encouraging that the working group exists, and I'm the eternal optimist, as you know, Akshay. So I believe something will come out of this, though the issues are, as I said, very emotional, very complex.
And we all should be at least optimists, at least in our profession. You mentioned the critical technologies and climate technologies, and I think one important link between climate and green and the critical technologies and critical minerals that we are talking about is that a lot of the new green technologies you require the critical minerals for which there is a lot of dependency on a very narrow set of countries and companies. So hopefully we can also look at not just the digital supply chains, but also the green supply chains. And if we were to really achieve our targets for green energy or our climate targets, then we will have to at some point resolve the green supply chains as well. I think with that, we're out of time, but perhaps I can just take a minute to summarize. I hear from Ambassador Tong that I think this idea that Quad has taken and be doing things to build muscle memory seems to be good. It seems to be the right thing to do. The progress is moderate but firm and more certain, and that at this point both Ambassador Tong and Dr. Kawai has said that the economic imperative seems a little unnatural, perhaps scope creep, and so we should not force fit it, but there might be some specific sectors of the economy, certain economic activities that can potentially be supported. And I hear from Ambassador Reddy and from Jennifer that it's really important for us to start cooperating on critical infrastructure and critical technologies. And here, the work that is being done to put some foundational guiding principles in place is very important. And that has implications for other aspects of the economy, both on climate and green related issues, but of course also defense and defense capability and larger issues of the Indo-Pacific. With that, all that's left for me to do is thank the panelists for joining us. I appreciate your time, and we hope that you will connect with the ORF platform going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akshay, and thanks to all my fellow panelists. It was a pleasure interacting with you.